Querying, a humiliation ritual which forces aspiring authors to overcome their delusions via completely destroying their sympathetic nervous system. Nah, I'm just kidding. It's just sending a bunch of emails to literary agents to see if they care to represent your book to publishers. However, there is a reason they call it the querying trenches. So just like so many other creators before me on this platform, I wanted to share what it's like when you survive the query trenches, but your book does not. Hi everyone, I'm Deanna, and I'm trying to scribble my way to becoming a traditionally published author. And today we're talking about the first time that I ever tried to achieve that goal and failed with my first fantasy novel. And spoiler alert, even with all the resources in the world, it was not pretty. I'm actually kind of scared to film this video because first of all, I'm scared of crying, but also I am kind of worried about how this is going to impact how anyone I work with in future sees me, because it's not like I did anything horrifically wrong, like I didn't attack any agents, God forbid. I know a lot of people kind of end up verbally attacking those that reject them, which is obviously horrible. So nothing crazy like that, but I still somehow feel like I fell short, I guess. I mean, at the end of the day, it was my first try, and the whole point is to learn from the experience. So that's kind of the spirit with which I'm going into this video, and I'm hoping it's cathartic and helpful for me and for all of you watching, anyone going through the same thing or about to start the process. This one's for you. So first of all, I want to just give you some background about the book that I queried. So I never vlogged about this book because this was way before I had this YouTube channel, but just for the sake of ease, let's call this first book that I ever wrote Project Vine. Not least because I miss Vine and I think it's much better than TikTok. The good old days. So I sent my first query for this novel back in October 2024, and you may or may not be shocked, depending on how much you know about querying, to know that I received my final response, or lack of response actually, only this month, which for those watching the future is March 2026. So we're gonna look at what I did to prepare for the querying process, the actual querying timeline, tips that I have for people, and kind of my future plans with querying in a minute. But yeah, let's just go into how this book came about quickly before we start, because I think it's important to the backstory of why this journey was genuinely so crushing for me. And also, if you want to find out more about the actual writing process itself, you can also watch my About the Author video, which has a lot more detail on the book itself. But to summarize, I literally started writing Project Vine when I was 10 years old. Now, I'm very much not 10 years old anymore. I think in total, from writing that first chapter to when I felt like it was finished, it took me literally 15 years of working on the book on and off. So when I tell you that this was the book of my soul, I'm genuinely not being hyperbolic. It really felt like I was sending out the most vulnerable part of myself to be decimated by the industry, which is so dramatic, but that is what the experience was like for me. Obviously, the book had changed an incredible amount through those 15 years that I was working on it. I think I lost track of how many actual versions and drafts there were, because obviously I was a kid for a large portion of those, and I would start a new draft, get about 15,000 words in, and then by that point I would have improved so much that I would just start the next draft again rather than forging on and finishing that one, which is not how you should do things, but you know, I didn't know at the time. Obviously, I had nothing like a writing routine or knew anything about plotting structures. I was literally just vibing entirely off of the books that I had read when I was at whatever age I was writing at. And you know, I had read a lot. I had been a huge reader since I was literally 2 years old. But you know, just by the nature of having so many exams to prepare for that would decide my future, and honestly a difficult home life, I didn't have as much time or capacity to write as I would have liked. But what that did mean is that reading and writing became a huge psychological escape and crutch for me when I was young. And looking back, I think that means I probably never should have queried this book at all. I mean, how do you take the thing that is so heavily responsible for you surviving a bunch of mental illness and abuse and turmoil and distance yourself enough from that thing to A, see it objectively, and B, actually be able to take criticism on it and send it out to be rejected over and over again? Like, I was wrong for that. I shouldn't have done that to myself. But that's just the benefit of hindsight. I never could have guessed it would be so difficult, even though now in retrospect it seems obvious. Anyway, not to jump ahead, but basically I spent my school years, university years, and the first part of my adult years finishing and polishing up this novel, Project Vine. And the most relevant part of this to the querying process was that even though the basic premise stayed the same, you know, it was about two sisters who basically got sucked into the problems of this fantasy world they didn't know existed and found out that everyone in their life was lying to them. But the thing that changed the most was the point of view that the novel was told, which was first person omniscient. So if you've read like The Book Thief, that's basically the point of view. If you haven't read it, the story is told from the point of view of an omniscient character. In the case of Book Thief, it was Death. In my case, it was a fairy that was trapped on Earth, who had tremendous powers but couldn't get out of her prison, and she was basically bored and whiling away her time by spying on humans using her omniscience, until she basically realizes that these two sisters might be able to help her get back home to the fairy world. So I was really proud of this idea and the structure of the novel, even though it took me many drafts and many years to get right, because honestly it was quite challenging. I mean, I was learning to write a book for the first time while also learning to write from this weird point of view. But that's what I like to write, and I've always liked to write and will continue to write. You know, I like playing around with readers' expectations and also with the point of view and structure of the stories I tell. And this is a problem that will crop up later in the querying process. So I first felt that the book was ready for beta readers around draft, oh my god, 10 or 11, I think. And this was in 2022. I used the subreddit beta readers to find someone to read it and basically swap out with their manuscript. So I read theirs and they read mine. I just found one person to begin with, and honestly, they obliterated my book. Like, I literally tried to find their feedback on my computer, on my Google Docs, and I couldn't find it. Like, I think once I actually went through it, implemented, thought about it, and was done with it, I just deleted it because it was so crushing at the time. And honestly, I feel like it's a shame that I don't have it, because like, they were right. My partner, who's now my fiance and who I still live with, Dan, he tried reading the book at this time, and I don't even think he managed to get through it, because it basically turned out that all the stuff that was in my head, like all the subterfuge, all the secrets, the people lying to each other, all of that had stayed in my head. I hadn't put it on the page in a way that was understandable, or in a way that made the reader give a damn, honestly. So, you know, I took some time to properly digest the feedback and saw that they were right, and I went back and redrafted the whole thing over the course of the next year. Also, I had already jumped the gun and bought a subscription to Query Tracker, which, if you don't know, is like the website to use for planning out which agents you're going to query. I've been paying for that subscription since 2022 because honestly, I like to creep on what agents are doing a little bit, to be honest. But anyway, aside from my bad financial decisions, I ended up with draft 12 the following year, which I sent out to 4 beta readers this time because I was a lot more confident in this version. They came back with some really good feedback. I found 2 people who were really big fans, actually. They really liked what I'd done with the story and the structure, and, you know, I feel like they really understood what I was going for, which I really appreciated. Then I made their suggested changes, did another little round of edits, and honestly, at that point, I was so burnt out on this book. This was version 12, 13, that I just sent it again to those 2 beta readers who I felt like understood the story the most, and just had them kind of say, yeah, I think you've addressed what we were worried about, because I kind of trusted them at this point, to be honest. And I just couldn't go through more criticism. I think I was done. And after that final round of addressing any tiny small things they had quibbles with, that's when I started finally sending out draft 13 of Project Vine to agents. The word count was 110,000 words, which I'd go on to cut slightly, but honestly there wasn't that much left to cut. I think I'd really done what I could for that story. It was quite bulky and complicated. Not the best debut decision, let me tell you. And I think if we're going to talk about mistakes, I'll mention this later, but one mistake was definitely the word count. So I saw someone, again, I think it was on Reddit, did a statistical analysis of the word counts of people getting agented, again, on Query Tracker, and they found that your chances for getting queried once you pass the 100,000 word mark goes down like significantly. Obviously, that's not the only reason those people are or aren't getting agented, but it seemed like a pretty solid bet, because again, it's kind of hard for publishing to take such a huge financial gamble on someone new and untested, so a shorter debut is mostly favored, I think, by agents and publishers alike. And that's also the reason that my current project that I'm working on, that I hope to query by the end of the year, Project Lightwood, is aiming to be about 90,000 words instead. So that's the background of the book. Let's move on to querying prep. I am going to do a proper querying prep process video when I get around to that again with my current project, Project Lightwood. But just to give you an idea of kind of what my prep looked like this first time around, since the book was away with beta readers pages for at least a month at a time each time. That's when I did most of my query prep. So, you know, I knew almost nothing about querying before. So obviously the first thing I did was watch every YouTube video. Specifically, shout out, as I'm sure so many people have done, to Alexa Dunn, who's like the OG, like just the most amazing videos about writing in general. But her querying videos specifically became like my gospel. Like I think I must have accounted for about 50 of the views on each of them just by myself. But also obviously I read a bunch of online articles and also a bunch of advice on another subreddit called Pub Tips. If you don't know Pub Tips, it is basically a place where people from the publishing industry, whether that's authors, some aspiring authors, some agents and agents assistants, and kind of people from publishing in general, hang out and give advice to people who are drafting their queries. And so people can come in, post their query and get it critiqued by people who have been doing this for a while and mostly know what they're talking about. I would highly recommend checking out that subreddit if you are workshopping your own query. I will say the critiques can be or can feel quite harsh at first, but honestly, they get the job done. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a query get worse while I was getting workshopped on there by people helping. So definitely have a read and see what you think. Even if you don't post your own query, if you're too scared to do that, like read what people are saying about other people's queries and absorb as much as you can. So that would honestly be my first port of call. If I had to do it all over again, I would head straight there first, probably, though I mean, maybe it might have scared me off if I didn't have Alexa Dunn's videos to tide me over first and kind of give me a bit of that calm. But anyway, obviously I had to write my query at that point, and even though my novel had 13 drafts at this point, my query had way more. I posted just 6 versions on the subreddit by itself, and that was only because you're allowed to post once a week. I definitely would have spammed them more if they didn't have that rule, so that's a good rule to have. And I was literally rewriting and tweaking this query like every hour for days and weeks at a time. So I checked, and the number of versions that I have in my original querying document is 14 versions, but I know it's way more than that because at a certain point I got tired of saving like each version and just gave up and started just improving it and not looking back. And I took quite a lot of harsh but needed feedback, both from that subreddit and people in my life and some writer acquaintances and those beta readers, and basically anyone I could get my hands on before I finally arrived at a version of the query that I was not happy with, but that people deemed ready. At this point, I was so burned out and doubting my judgment and confused more than anything that, just like the saying goes about how art is not finished, it is abandoned, that's how I felt about my query. I was like, I just don't think I can improve this. This is probably the best it could be, but at my current skill level, this is probably it. So yeah, that's the query that I went out with the first time. It definitely didn't help that pitching my first person omniscient point of view was so difficult in a query because the narrator, if you want to call her that, wasn't really the main character. The sisters were, but then everything's told from the narrator's point of view. So like her view on things bleeds into everything. And yeah, I think I was definitely punching above my weight with this book in general, and the query showed that, but I couldn't just give up on it, so I forged ahead for better or worse. And I hated writing the query. I'm just going to say that. It was so hard. And obviously during this time, I also wrote the other materials like the synopsis, which is basically a 1 or 2 page summary of the whole plot with the spoilers. I wrote a little author bio, just everything that I needed to submit to agents. And also obviously made the list of agents on Query Tracker and vetted them and everything. And like I said, I'll go through the full process in a different video, but suffice to say that in the absence of anything else to control, I went very heavy on planning and vetting this agent list, and I made a very complicated Excel spreadsheet. Well, it was on Sheets rather, but same difference. Kind of checking their activity on Bookseller or Publishers Marketplace, depending on whether they were from the UK or the US. Obviously checking their genre and the website and everything on Query Tracker, and then putting all that into my spreadsheet separately. So I'll give you a quick preview here of kind of what it looked like. Again, I'll be going over it in more detail another time, but the part that I wanted to mention here was I basically had a column that summarized the materials that each agent said they needed, whether on the agency website or or on their query tracker profile. And that meant that I could get all the materials ready ahead of time, because some of them, it was like, oh, we just want the query letter. For some people, it was, we want the first 5 pages, 10 pages, 50 pages. I think the smallest one was like first 3,000 words, but they varied a lot. Same thing with the synopsis. Some places only wanted a 500-word synopsis. Some places wanted a 2-page synopsis. So I basically had all of these from each agent listed in the spreadsheet, and then I could make all the materials ahead of time while I waited for my beta readers to be done with the book. And then I broke the agents up into batches, and when everything was ready, I started querying, starting with agents from the UK, because that's where I live. Okay, so now we finally get to the timeline of the querying itself. God help me not cry. Okay, to kind of see all this, I used Query Tracker, the emails that I got back from agents, just to reconstruct the timeline for myself, because there are some things that I forgot that made me upset all over again when I read through this stuff. But we'll get to that closer to the end, because that's where most of the disappointment is concentrated, unfortunately. So, October 26th, 2024, like a week before my birthday, I sent out the first 10 query batch to UK agents. Now, these were agents that I thought were probably a long shot in terms of fit, and if I were querying now, I don't think I would query them, not because there's anything wrong with them, but because I had kind of mixed up my genre tags a little bit. I think the tag was general fiction, and I had tried researching it, and it wasn't super clear to me what it was. Now I think I have it mostly nailed down. It's mostly more realistic stuff. I'm gonna check that though, because now I'm kind of worried. Is that right? Yeah, it's basically non-genre. Anyway, I got some confusing responses from Google when I was first looking this up, so I chucked a couple people on the list that represented general fiction that I probably shouldn't have. My book's about fairies. It has nothing to do with day-to-day life. I guess it's kind of like contemporary. Anyway, the point is, I queried 10 agents that probably weren't really a fit. I was trying to be safe, I was trying to go for fast responders, but really, I should have just queried fantasy agents and just bitten the bullet and taken the loss. But I was so scared. I was so afraid to burn through any kind of goodwill in case my query package wasn't actually ready. And I think fear is the dominant theme of my querying journey, to be honest. And actually, even though these were mostly fast responders, most of them did not in fact respond. And what I ended up finding out later was, and this is maybe a good tip for anyone else who's going to query in the UK, is that there is much more of a no response culture amongst UK agents than US. So in my next querying attempt, I'm definitely going to be mixing UK and US agents together. For this first attempt, I did just query all the UK agents first before moving on to the US agents, which I don't think is the right way to do it. Because of this, basically, it meant that I only got 3 responses out of the first 10 queries I sent. They were all obviously rejections, and it made me wonder whether it was my manuscript or like what was really going on, when really if I had also queried some US agents who are more likely to respond, I might have gotten an actual idea of the fact that something about my package wasn't working, rather than thinking, oh, maybe it's just not enough of a sample size. But like I said, I did get my rejection. I got my first rejection only 2 days later, on the Monday. So this person was very efficient. It was their assistant emailing me to say it's not a fit for their list, and they're being very selective at the moment because their list is very full. And in general, spoilers right now, but I did almost exclusively get non-personalized rejection, so generic template rejections, and CNRs, or closed no responses, as in I was just ignored, which are also very common, in fact way more common than actual rejections. And closed no responses were mostly auto-marked by Query Tracker as closed at 120 days. But I will preface here that in my opinion, and this isn't wrong or right, but in a lot of other querying videos I've seen, it feels like to me some authors overestimate the number of personalized rejections they're actually getting. So for me, because of everything I've seen on the PubTips subreddit, and also through the comments on Query Tracker that other people querying have left, showing the rejections they've gotten, unless a rejection says something specific about your manuscript, it's not personalized to me. Now, the word specific is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because for some people, specific means, oh, I loved your characters, but to me, specific is, I loved your characters, name and how they did blah blah blah. So to me, the one with names is the personalized rejection, and the other one might be a form, honestly. And most of the time I found that I was right. Like when I went and checked what other people were saying this agent responded to them when they rejected them, it was the exact same thing that they said to me, even if they did praise my characters or my setting or whatever it was. So as a result, I only technically counted 4 personalized rejections from the way that I see things. But it's totally possible that if someone else were getting these kinds of responses, they might think more of the rejections I got were personalized. Honestly, maybe I'm a pessimist for that. I don't know, but that's the way I kind of sorted things, just so you're aware. Anyway, I only managed to sit through 2 rejections before I got impatient and sent out my next batch. Now, I do have ostensibly a good reason for this. I had been reading a lot online around the time that basically querying was much slower now, and there were less and less agents actually responding rather than leaving things kind of closed, no response. So the advice had shifted from sending a 10 query batch to sending a 20 query batch. And I thought, well, that sounds reasonable to me. I'm certainly seeing a very slow response trickle. So I sent another 10 off, basically over the week after I first started querying. And then I made myself wait a little bit, even though it was really hard. And then I waited those out and I got 5 rejections out of the 20 and silence otherwise. And this sucked. But I also felt like I was probably still, playing it too safe with the kinds of agents I was sending it to. I was still sending it to people who are maybe not the perfect fit, might not be interested in my specific brand of fantasy, and also knew my book was kind of weird and UK agents didn't respond that often anyway, so I wasn't totally crushed yet. After which I did one more batch, and then that basically left me with just the agents I was scared to query because they were dream agents or huge in the business, or I felt like they were basically a perfect fit for my book, and it was like, if they reject me, what am I doing? This book is dead. The UK market is much smaller than the US, so I think I only had about 50 or so. Yeah, 50 or so UK agents to query, so it really wasn't like, it seemed like a lot, like, oh my god, 50 rejections, but I mean, you saw the thumbnail to this video, you know it's going to get much worse than that. And just as background as well, during all this, my life was kind of crazy. So at work, we just had this restructure where some people were let go and management was being really shady and it was really weird and scary. And then in November, literally like a month after I started querying, I ended up having to have an operation which confirmed that I had a chronic illness called endometriosis, which I talk about on this channel sometimes about how it affects my life. But that's when I actually got the diagnosis and I was kind of facing like what that meant for me and how my life was going to have to be different going forward as my symptoms got worse and worse. And while all this was happening, I was also having to deal with being told over and over again, multiple times a week, that the only thing I cared about and thought I was good at in terms of things that I could do, writing, I was actually not good at all. The thing that I had revolved my whole life around and that I had prided myself on being able to do and that had saved me as a child. It was a hard time, but it was going to get worse, I'm sorry to say. So this whole kind of process had taken me up to January 2025. So only like 2.5 months of querying, which is honestly not even that long looking back, but it felt like an eternity. The holiday period had been hard because of everything going on. The rejections and silence were slowly wearing me down, especially due to the lack of actionable feedback. Because when you read online, a lot of the time people are like, oh, don't send out all your queries, do it in batches so that if you get any feedback, you can fix what's wrong with your query package or book. But more and more, I started seeing the rhetoric online of people being like, nobody gives feedback anymore. You just have to cast it into the void and make your peace with whatever happens. And I was like, I can't do that. Why can't they just write a single line, a sentence, anything to tell me what is wrong with what I've written? Because obviously when you have no feedback, you just assume the worst. I just assumed that my book was worthless garbage. I don't actually think that anymore as much. There are still days. It didn't help also that the holiday season slows everything down because, people are off. So I was just sitting there waiting and getting nothing except for form rejections. And so looking at all of this, before I sent out my last batch in the UK market to all the agents I was afraid of, I rewrote my query. Now, originally I had written it in, I guess, the American style, which is the style that basically everyone online talks about and uses and pub tips talks about, and all agents all over the world kind of say, no, we'll take this, like you don't need to tailor it specifically to our market. But I did know there was a specific UK query version. It's basically a bunch shorter and more pithy. So I decided to rewrite it into that style for the last batch just in case it helped. Now this got me fucked up because now I'm saying this, I'm like, or was it the other way around? Did I try the UK version first and then switch to the American version? I changed something. And it didn't work, is the point. Again, I was just so downtrodden and looking for any way to control the situation when there is no controlling the situation. This is a lesson we will talk about later, but you just gotta accept it. You gotta internalize that shit. Anyway, on January 28th, 2025, I went out with that query to those agents that I was afraid of. And of course, I was rejected from every single one of them. I sent out a few stragglers to, you know, just people who'd been closed before, that kind of thing. And this took a few months, and I took those few months to completely stew in my failure. I tried to find like a crumb of validation and serotonin, and that's how I ended up participating in a couple of pitch events over on Blue Sky. These used to happen on Twitter, but obviously Twitter is dead now, forever, RIP. I don't want to hear about the zombie that's taken its place. And so in February, I participated in Quest Pit. And that's where I got my one and only agent like, which was very exciting because it was literally the first piece of response I'd had from an agent, positive response, but also any kind of feedback at all that wasn't just a generic no. Obviously, I was very excited about this, but I tried not to let myself get too excited, and that was a good thing because after I did send my actual query package to the agent, they rejected me about a week later. They were a fairly new agent, so I think they were casting a pretty wide net. But anyway, that did give me a little bit of hope to continue querying. Obviously, I was crushed that it looked like I wouldn't get to work with an agent from the UK, which was kind of my original plan and hope because I really wanted to see them in person if I could, visit the offices, that kind of thing. But I had to just accept that probably wasn't going to happen with this book. So it was just as well that in March, I'd started writing my next book, my current book, Project Lightwood, that I am vlogging the process of. And I did that because I had been told that that was supposed to help with the anxiety of querying, but I found it really hard. I think the best advice actually is that people give is to start writing the next thing before you start querying. Trying to start writing it while I was already querying, it didn't help. I was so far in my head, I was so dismayed and disappointed with myself that honestly, writing the first draft of this new book took me 9 months. I mean, which, don't get me wrong, is much shorter than a decade or however long the first draft of the previous book had taken me, but still, it just dragged. But that's what I get for trying to write when I'm so riddled with self-doubt. I first started querying my US agents, sending out my first batch on the 11th of April. And at first, all this yielded was another rash of rejections, and I was kind of over it at this point. But about a month later, on the 13th of May, I was checking my inbox when I saw my first and only full request for this novel from a huge agency in the US. It read, "Thank you for reaching out regarding Project Vine. We would be happy to consider your submission. Please click on the link below to upload a double-spaced PDF of your full manuscript. We will review it and let you know if it is the right fit for us." And I literally ran across the house shaking to tell my partner about it. And I also have to warn you, this is unfortunately the highest point in my querying journey. It is truly all downhill from here. And it's depressing in hindsight, but obviously at the time, I was ecstatic. Like, it was crazy. This was one of the biggest agencies in the country, and even just getting a full request made me feel like maybe I hadn't wasted 15 years of my life. And to be honest, I still try to hold on to that, even after all the disappointment, because, like, they must have seen something that wasn't terrible to get a full request. Not everyone gets one, after all. But at the time, I must have reread the invitation to submit the full like a million times because I was certain I must have understood it wrong. I could just not believe my eyes. And this is less common with US agents, but some UK agents actually say that if you get a full request, you should notify them. So that's what I set about doing. I sent a notification of full manuscript requests to every single UK agent who hadn't outright rejected me and who I had submitted to previously. And that was how I got my first personalized rejection, which read, "Congratulations on the interest and thank you for the update. I remember reading this. I admired the atmospheric writing, but I'm going to go ahead and step aside as I didn't feel as fully drawn in as I would have liked. Best of luck with next steps and thank you for the chance to read." So atmospheric writing, that was nice to hear, but still not good enough and no reason for why. But you know, I took it. I was like, you know what, it's good to just hear anything that wasn't just a generic no. So I was very grateful to that agent for taking the time to respond, even though ultimately it was a pass from them. And during this time, I kind of let loose and sent my querying package much more widely because that's kind of the advice. Like, once you get your first full request, you can feel like, okay, your packages and your query and your first pages are actually working, you can query more widely, and now it was just a matter of time to wait and see what the full request came to, if anything, and see if you got any more bites in the meantime. Obviously, during this time, I kept obsessively researching how long agents usually take to get back on a full, which is any amount of time from like a couple of days to 2 years, so that wasn't helpful. But I did also track how the agent was moving through their inbox using the Query Tracker Premium subscription, where you can basically see as they go through and request new fills and reject previous fills that they have out. And they were getting closer and closer to my query, which was very nerve-wracking. But at a certain point, I didn't even want to know the answer. Getting this fill had given me so much more hope than I'd had throughout the entire process that I really was kind of begging for them to just take as long as they could. Because with everything else happening in my life, which we'll talk about in a minute, I really needed this one thread of hope to hold on. But unfortunately, it didn't hold on for very long, because 45 days later, on the 30th of June, the same week that I was told that I would be let go from my job, I received the first and only rejection on a full that I would get for Project Vine. It read, "Thanks so much for giving us the chance to consider Project Vine. We found a lot to like with the premise you created, but ultimately we didn't connect with the voice here the way we'd hoped to. So although we appreciate your interest, we're not able to accept your submission at this point." Now, I see myself as quite a resilient person. In fact, at one point, me and my friends were having this silly conversation based on like a online quiz we were doing, and one of the questions was like, "Oh, what do you think is your friend's best quality?" And my friend said that my best quality was my resilience. It was my ability to get back up no matter how many times I'm kicked in the face. I have been through things in my life that have debilitated me psychologically and physically, and affect me to this day, and will continue to affect me for the rest of my life. So when I tell you this was one of the darkest periods of my life that I've ever experienced, I do not say that lightly at all. I had just lost my job. Just a few months ago, I had been told that I have this chronic illness that will likely give me bouts of pain for the rest of my life and might make me infertile, and that I'll have to undergo regular operations for as well. And now the only glimmer of hope I'd had of publishing a book that I'd spent 15 years writing had been taken from me. I ended up having to go back into therapy for the first time in a decade to deal with this part of my life. Because not only had I lost my source of income, that's obviously a huge blow to anyone, but I had felt like I lost my identity and a hugely important coping mechanism that was kind of load bearing for my ability to function. There were so many times in my life where I turned to writing this book as a source of comfort. Like I would literally be typing it with tears streaming down my face, trying to distract myself from whatever was going on by following the adventures of these characters. I loved them. You know, they were like family to me. And seeing their story get rejected over and over again felt like a personal rejection, which it shouldn't have. That's not what querying is at all, but that's what it became to me. Now, I have experienced death in my family, and I don't speak lightly when I say that seeing this book die in the trenches felt like seeing a loved one die. And not to mention, it was a huge emotional crutch for me. 100%. During so many dark moments in my life, my brain would instantly fall back on, oh, but at least we're writing this book and it's going to get published and it's going to be amazing. When we struggled financially, I dreamt that I'd be able to make this book a bestseller and I'd be able to help my family out. When people bullied me at school, I dreamt that one day I'd be able to prove to them that I wasn't as worthless as they thought by becoming a successful author. When I felt depressed and hated myself, this part of me, this novel, was the only thing that I could see of any worth. And now I had been told by dozens of people that even that part was worth nothing after all. And by extension, so was I. Obviously, that isn't true. That's not what they were saying, but that's what it felt like. And you know, I've been in dark places before, and I knew that this was a very dark place to be in. Hence the therapy. And obviously during this time, I also ended up taking a break from querying too. Since the full rejection had mentioned voice, I ended up starting a 14th full edit of the novel, which honestly didn't even change much, but I think I just needed to do in order to, again, feel even some form of control over the situation. The main change was the word count, so I cut just over 3,000 words, not a lot, but it was 107,000 now, and I also changed the first half, the first chapter, to be a bit tighter, more dynamic, more character-driven, just better overall. The logic was obviously that if I got another full request, which I really hoped I would, I'd have this updated version ready to go, and that's that's what I clung on to as I sent out my next batch of queries in August. So I think I took about a month and a half off. I was just desperate to find someone else who would give my weird book a chance. And since now I knew my query package did work and I felt like I had only improved it, I just sent out my materials to all the rest of the agents on my list. No more batches, no more prolonging the wait, because I just couldn't do it anymore. I really do think one of the hardest parts of querying for me, and I'm sure for other people too, was the waiting. Like, it really is absolutely soul destroying. And not because I'm impatient, and this is going to sound dramatic again, but again, I'm only ever talking about things that I've personally been through and comparing it to those experiences. So if you know anything about complex PTSD or abuse, you know that what's super harmful for the brain about those things is they keep you in a state of stress or fight or flight, basically with no relief for long periods of time. This affects you on every level, particularly your nervous system, because it makes you feel completely helpless, because you are not able to fight or flight, because you're not able to act, you're not able to get out of those situations, and they keep recurring. It makes you feel like no matter what you do, you are trapped. So you constantly feel like you're in a dangerous situation, but you have no power, no agency to get out of it. You end up feeling helpless and incredibly anxious and like you're constantly under mortal danger. And having experienced those other things before, that's pretty much how querying made me feel. Every moment of every day that I was actively sending my book out, I was cringing or waiting for another blow, another rejection, another piece of bad news, another close no response query that I'd have to clean out of the tracker myself. Even when I managed to put it to the back of my mind, there was still this lingering, overhanging sense of fear and dread. And it's hard facing every week knowing that on average twice a week, you will be told that all the hard work you've put in isn't connecting with other people. And look, now that I've done it and I know I can survive it and I'm not actually in any danger, I think querying came to feel a lot easier towards the end and hopefully will feel a lot easier the next time around. But going through it the first time, hoping against all hope that you'll get somewhere and just getting crushed repeatedly, especially during a time in my life where I was already struggling and suffering so much with my job and my health, it felt like the end of the world. It felt like everything I had known had crumbled overnight. And honestly, it made me desperate for it to be over one way or another. So yes, I stopped batching queries and I sent out to all the rest of the agents I had, and that might have been a mistake, but to be honest, I completely stand by it because I know my mental health couldn't take it anymore. I also set a deadline for myself saying I had to stop actively sending out queries exactly a year after I had started, so October 26th. And you know, during this time, there were so many other moments of hope that ultimately turned to despair. Like, for instance, there was an agent whose manuscript wish list basically exactly matched my book down to the tiny details, and they still rejected me within a week. There was one agent that I followed up with because they'd gone over deadline and they had asked for nudges, and they said they were still looking at it, only to also reject me a few days later. But as deadline day came closer, as it were, I also had the most personalized rejections I had ever gotten in the process. 3 of them, in fact, in pretty quick succession. So I got one on the 25th of June that basically boiled down to this comment: even though we found great qualities in your work and were intrigued by the idea behind the story, we felt that the narrative relied heavily on telling and exposition at times, which I felt was probably fair. And I tried to fix it in my last little edit, but honestly, I think it was just baked into the way the story was obviously told from this weird point of view. So I felt like, to an extent, it was a personal taste thing that couldn't really be changed without changing the fundamental structure of the novel. But then I got another one on September 20th that basically boiled down to them saying they already had a client that had a similar book and they didn't want to put us into competition, which was crushing. But I did verify that wasn't a boilerplate response because there was only one other person several years back that had received this response. So I knew that was a personalized rejection for sure. And that was really hard and that stung so bad. But the one that really got me was actually one I got on the 14th of July. So like a month after I got my full rejection. In a nutshell, it was this amazing agent who represents a fantasy series that, like, if I told you the name of, you would instantly know it. And she held on to my query. Like, she rejected almost everyone before me and held on to about 4 fantasy queries for like 2 months. And obviously I drove myself crazy over this one. I kept checking query tracker. She was on holiday and I didn't know what to do with myself. But in the end, I did get a personalized rejection from her, which told me the thing that I had been waiting to hear all this time. There was nothing wrong with my book. In fact, the agent said it was strong and well written, but they had no idea how to sell it or who to. And that was all that it boiled down to. And I mean, hearing that, I think that was really it. Like, I was cooked. It was such a relief to hear, but at the same time felt so unfair that even though my work was of publishable quality, it was just too weird to survive in the current market. And obviously publishing is a business, like obviously I understand that, but it just made me feel like if only I had a little bit of clout, like maybe if it was my second book it would work. And I'm still hoping that might happen in future, but oh god, it was excruciating because it's something I couldn't change. I had never been super interested in writing specifically to market in that way. Obviously, I'd be happy to write a book if I was interested in it and it happened to be to market, but I found it hard to contort myself into those kinds of boxes. And despite this experience, I don't really see that changing. So I have no idea how or when I'm going to manage to get published, how the stars will have to align for the market to be right for the kinds of books that I enjoy creating. But as things are going right now, I can't really see myself changing my process. Anyway, when I first started querying, I'll be honest, I never thought that I'd get to a point where I just didn't care about rejections anymore, but by the end of the year, mercifully, that was exactly what happened. But that's not quite the end of the tale. This might be where I fucked up. Or at least this is when I decided that it was already probably over, the book was dead in the trenches, and I might as well go out with a bang. So I came up with the only last-ditch effort that I could think of. I was going to query my fantasy novel to the literary and upmarket agents on Query Tracker. And I know what you're thinking. This girl had a mental breakdown. But I swear this made some sort of sense in my mind. Okay, like I had just been told by an agent whose opinion I genuinely trusted that this book wasn't really right for genre, but it was good. But like I said, I love writing books like that and I intended that to be my career. So clearly I needed an agent who would know how to sell those weird kinds of books. And where else is literary exploration valued if not for literary and upmarket? So I thought if my writing is not exactly a fit for genre fiction, maybe a literary agent would be able to help me out instead and have the contacts to actually place it somewhere. And again, I was at that point where I refused to be precious about this. So I literally sat down one day and sent out one whole batch of 56 queries to literary and upmarket agents that I thought might fit because they had some crossover with fantasy or had a bit of an interesting manuscript wish list. And to be honest, that is how I ended up with 200 rejections when all was said and done. And there you go, that was my last moment of madness. After that, it was just a matter of sitting and waiting for the time to run out. I put out a few more queries to agents that had been closed when I first batched my queries and had reopened since, and I basically did that right up until the deadline. And at this point, I only got rejections and closed no responses. There was no more feedback on my book, no more interest, no more full requests, which I guess is to be expected. In the end, the book wasn't genre enough for genre and it wasn't literary enough for literary. And the last thing I did before stopping querying altogether was send it out to a small publishing house in the UK, an indie publishing house that basically takes open submissions. And that was the response that I was waiting for until March, because they basically said, oh, give us 3 months, and if you don't hear back, then it's a no. So it was just last week that, with a note of finality, I was forced to accept that my book had not only died in the trenches, it had been buried there. And I mourned it. And then I started this AuthorTube channel because I was still unemployed until very recently and I was driving myself insane. But obviously more than that, I wanted to share my journey, both working on my next book and hopefully being able to look back in videos just like this to help other writers not make the same mistakes that I did, such as spending 15 years writing a book, or querying a book that is a psychological crutch for you, or querying like 50 agents who have nothing to do with your genre. There are many more mistakes that you can learn from on this channel, I promise. Just go back to my other videos. And we'll look at this light at the end of the tunnel in a bit more detail in a minute, but first I wanted to just quickly run over the query stats, which is the real reason you're here, let's be honest. So, in terms of my final stats, I sent out 207 queries. One of those turned into a full request that ended up in a rejection, and the other 206 were all rejections. So I broke it down both by form rejection and close no response, and by how many had actually come from each country, UK and US. So I got 79 total form rejections, 59 of those are from the US and 20 were from the UK. I got 123 closed no responses in total. 33 of those were from the UK and 90 were from the US. And just some other stats that I thought might be interesting. Out of all my agents, 119 asked for queries to be sent through email. 70 agents worked through Query Manager, which is an offshoot of Query Tracker, and 18 asked for other online forms. And anecdotally, UK agents were way more likely to opt for email. A US agent kind of went between the two, but we're more likely to use Query Manager. And online forms were like a complete outlier. We're actually quite rare. And also, the fastest response I got was on the same day that I queried, and the longest response I got took 243 days. It gives you the real range of response times. So, after such a harrowing experience, what advice can I give people? I've got 7 tips here, and they're not about the actual prepping process or anything. These are more like general tips. Like I said, the actual querying process and advice and common mistakes and stuff video will come in a few months. But to preserve to preserve your sanity, which I have lost. Tip number 1, temper your expectations. Obviously, everyone wants to believe they're going to be a unicorn, and some of you watching this will be unicorns, but most of us are regular humans, and the querying process is going to be tough for us. So this might sound toxic, and maybe this is not the best advice for everyone, but honestly, if I could go back, I would go in with the mindset that I was going to fail. Like, instead of having this starry-eyed, like, oh my god, like, it's finally happening, I've worked on it so long, that surely means it's going to be a success. Nothing is guaranteed, nothing is promised, which is also going to be the last point, but we'll get there in a sec. It is statistically much more likely that you will be crushed by this process than come out happy with the result, unfortunately. Especially for your first time querying, everyone always says this. I completely ignored it, and I'm sure you will too. If it's your first time querying, you're going to think, no, I'm the exception, I'm the one who's going to get signed on my first book. The chances truly are low for most of us. And honestly, maybe that's not a bad thing. Like, with the distance of a year or so, I do think that maybe that book would have been a difficult debut. Not that my current one's necessarily any better, but it is in some ways, and I do feel like it's stronger and hookier for the market, which maybe isn't saying much because my first book was apparently such a hard sell. But what I'm trying to say is, no matter how many times you get rejected, or if your first book or 10th book honestly dies in the trenches, that honestly might be a blessing in disguise, because you might realize actually you want to go out with a different book anyway, and you only get to debut once, so you want to do it right. Really, this is probably just a sore loser talk. I'm probably just trying to talk myself into accepting something that has hurt me deeply, but I guess we all have to do what we can. My second tip is setting yourself an end date. I honestly wish I'd just done this straight away. It seemed obvious that I was going to do it, kind of in the back of my head, but I really should have just said to myself, like, we will stop sending out queries exactly a year from now, and then maybe it wouldn't have felt like I was going to be in this horrible, harmful, hurtful purgatory forever. Like, I would have actually just had an end date. So I'm definitely going to do that with this querying round and know ahead of time, like, no matter the outcome, in a year it will be over. I genuinely think that's really important, especially for someone like me who feels like the process is perpetual and never ending, and it horrifies me and puts me in such a state of stress. My third tip is very basic. It's make sure the agents you're querying actually have any chance in hell of being interested in your book. Just like me, you might be tempted to send out to some agents that like are very loose fit. They might represent your genre, but they mostly do a totally different representation of it. And like, I know it's tempting to want to kind of practice on those agents, as it were, and see if anything is actually working. But the truth is, you're not going to get any useful information out of it. Like, if you just want to send out a query batch just to be like, I sent out a query batch and get past those first jitters, maybe that's fine, even though it is still a waste of time both for you and the agent. But really, just start sending out to agents that actually have any kind of chance of responding positively to you. Otherwise, the information you get back isn't even going to be helpful. Not that you might get any information back anyway, because it seems like, as I said, people are sending feedback much less now. But if you are going to batch query intentionally, do your research on the agents, and you just gotta go for it. You can't mince around because it won't actually get you anywhere in the end. It won't actually help you. It'll just prolong the process and make things more painful and make you have to face more rejections than you really need to. Tip number 4, start writing something new before you actually send your first query. I'm definitely going to do that this time around. I cannot start writing a new piece of work with querying already hanging over my head. I want to be like maybe a few chapters in, honestly, to a new thing before I even hit send on this next project, because it is so much harder to get into a new project once you already started the process. And it really does help having something else to work on to distract yourself from refreshing your emails constantly. Number 5, fairly self-explanatory, but easier said than done, is look after your mental health. I feel like maybe a few people might say this in the comments that like, oh, you should have like not had your email on your phone so that you weren't feeling this kind of pressure, because that's a common piece of advice. I will say for me, having my querying email not on my phone actually made things so much worse. Like I tried it out for about a week and I couldn't do it, because at least when I had it on my phone, I could distract myself and have the worry in the back of my mind. But when I didn't have it on my phone, it was always in the front, because I was constantly thinking, what if there's a follow request in there? What if there's a rejection in there? What's going on? I don't know. It's like having a closed box that you can't open until the end of the day. It drove me insane. So in the spirit of looking after your mental health, I would encourage you to do what works for you. And that's it, really. Like, do whatever you have to get through this experience, because it is horrifying. I mean, I don't want to scare you, right? Like, for some people, I'm sure it's fine. For people with healthier psychological, I was going to say backstories, for people with better mental health than me, who are maybe more grounded, who didn't make the mistake I did of sending out this incredibly psychologically fraught book out to the world, like, it seems like querying can be much chiller for those kinds of people. But if you're anything like me, if you have any struggles, any neurodivergencies, I urge you to go in expecting this to be hard and be pleasantly surprised, rather than go in thinking this isn't going to be that bad and then having the realization I did of being like, oh, this is one of the worst things I've ever experienced. Holy fuck. So yeah, look after yourself, however that looks like for you. Piece of advice number 6 is something I'm very guilty of, and I don't know if I'll be able to give up, but it is don't read the tea leaves. And you'll see this online a lot as well, and what it basically means is don't try and read into whatever is happening. Just take everything at face value. Like if an agent rejects you and says, the pacing was a bit off for me, and that's why I'm saying no, don't tear apart your whole book off the back of one single comment, because just like with beta readers, until at least 2 people have said the same thing, it doesn't mean anything. It's a matter of personal taste. That agent could be wrong. That could be a form rejection that has nothing to do with your actual book, because agents are busy people and they have to send out a lot of form rejections that they have pre-written and copy-pasted. So yeah, don't try to read too much into responses like that aren't clearly heavily personalized. And also try not to use Query Tracker to stalk what agents are doing. One of those personalized rejections I got, the one that told me that like there's nothing wrong with your book but I can't sell it, I could have saved myself months of anxiety if I just didn't look at what their agent was doing with their inbox. Like if I hadn't checked and seen that they'd rejected everyone else except for 4 manuscripts, including mine, I wouldn't have been in this constant state of anxiety for like 2 months waiting for a response. I would have just got on that rejection, been like, oh, okay, that's a shame, and hopefully moved on faster. So trying to track what agents are doing, trying to read into their movements through their inbox, trying to read into their words when it's just a form rejection will only hurt you. And it's so hard to not do it because you're so desperate for any kind of sign or feedback. But ultimately, it's not going to help. And that leads into my final tip, number 7, which is let go. And this is good advice for life as well as querying. Let go of control. Again, so much easier said than done. But in life, unfortunately, you have to accept that no matter how much work, how many hours, how much effort, how much of your soul and spirit and heart and blood and sweat and tears you put into something, at the end of the day, if you don't have that last little tiny drop of luck and timing, the thing isn't going to happen. And this is true of everything in life. Putting in more effort is like buying more lottery tickets. You know, the more hours you spend, the more you can imagine your lottery tickets kind of accumulate. But some people win with one lottery ticket, and some people can't win with 1,000. Do you know what I mean? So yes, do everything in your power to polish your query, to write a great query letter, to critique it, to critique the first pages and polish them up, and to critique the whole novel and polish that up. Make it as good as you possibly can, send it out into the world, and then let go of the situation, because now it is outside of your control. And yes, you can do what I did and rewrite your query multiple times during the process and rewrite your opening pages and blah, blah, blah. But like, none of that changed the outcome for me. For some people it will. For some people it will. I'm not saying you should just give up and let it, when you're getting clear signs that it's not working, just keep beating your head against a wall. But you also have to accept that you only know what you know. You don't know what you don't know, which sounds obvious. But, for me, if I had gotten that feedback earlier that there's nothing wrong with the book, it's actually just the market, I would have taken those other rejections so much more easily. Oh, well, I can't control that. But really, that might be happening to you. You might be in the same place that I was, where the timing was just not right, or you just didn't land in front of the right agent because they were closed, whatever it is. Like the saying goes, you need the strength to change what you can and the strength to accept what you can't. And that's kind of what I've tried to do. I can't control what happened with this book, but I can control what happens with the next one. For now, because I'm still writing it. So like I said, almost exactly a year ago in March 2025, I started writing my second novel, Project Lightwood, which is a fantasy dystopian novel about our world ending in a huge magical event that leaves it as a frozen wasteland, and the two main characters are making their way through this wasteland trying to protect a manuscript of canonical literary text, trying to preserve things for the next generation, while the magic has altered the world in a way where the only way to survive is burning your own memories for sustenance. And around the time that I was almost done with the first draft is, like I said, also when I started this channel. This was at the end of November last year, so like 3 months ago. And that's because I think one of the hardest parts of all this was how isolating it felt to go through. Like I said, I only really have writing acquaintances rather than friends, and as much support as I got from the people in my life, they're not writers. They don't really understand what I was feeling or going through for most of it. I wanted to join the online community of people that I could see on YouTube who did know what it felt like. Similarly, like I said, I think I've made so many mistakes in my writing journey and my querying journey and my life in general that other people can hopefully learn from, so that no one has to go through what I did alone. And also, obviously, as a result of working on my writing for so long, I think I also have a lot of valuable expertise too. So that's why I'm sharing that in my series on how to write a novel for beginners in a year, because no one should spend 15 years writing a novel like I did. That's just not necessary. And like I said, I am obviously vlogging the process of Project Lightwood, and I'm hoping to start querying by October again. Currently I'm working on draft 3 before it goes to beta readers in hopefully a few weeks. I haven't done any writing this week because I've been scripting and filming this video, and honestly it has been a wait. Can't imagine what this is going to look like once it's edited, or how long it's going to take me to actually get through it, because this was both cathartic and very difficult to film and go through again. And naturally, long term, as I say in every video, my goal is still to be traditionally published, no matter how many books or attempts that takes me. And considering it took some authors more than 10 manuscripts, we might be here for a while, guys. But what I'm working towards more than anything now is enjoying the journey rather than constantly thinking about the outcome like I was before, because that was really a big part of why this creating process was so tough on me. And like I said, even though Project Fine wasn't my debut and didn't get me signed with an agent, there are so many stories of authors getting an agent with a different book and then going back to their backlog and reviving those old projects and publishing them, that I still hope that someday you will get to read Project Vine, because it's so close to my heart, and I think it's a story that deserves to be told. Even if that doesn't happen for a while, and the manuscript might look a little different when it does come out. Okay, we made it to the end. Like I said, this was both so difficult and a huge relief to talk about and film, so thank you so much if you stuck through the whole thing with me. As always, if you found this interesting, or you had fun, or you related, please do subscribe, and you can come along for the ride with me on writing my next project, Project Lightwood. And the same thing if you're curious about my How to Write a Book for Beginners in a Year series. And also, of course, consider liking or commenting, because that really helps me out. Thanks so much for watching again. As always, I hope you have a great time of day, and I hope I'll see you next time. Bye!